Welcome to the show, Israel. This is Peter Helland with Dr. E. Michael Jones. The show Israel emphasizes that the New Testament says that Jesus is Israel, and we live in a day and age where Israel generally implies for most people the land in the Middle East. And what we see by that theme is you have the gospel, and then there's these forces that try to usurp the gospel. So Jesus is the true Israel, and yet today people think the nation over in the Middle East is the true Israel. And the theme that you just wrote your paper on, if I could stretch it, is that you have the gospel. Missionaries go out with the gospel, but then what happens is that the very gospel that they gave their life to gets changed, and they end up taking something secondary and making it primary, and the gospel goes secondary.
Yeah. But we're talking about Martin Scorsese's latest film, Silence, which is about the missionary activity in Japan. Missionary activity there began with St. Francis Xavier, who came from Portugal, went to Goa in India, and then sailed to Japan. First man to arrive in Japan. And through his efforts within a number of years, let's say that was around 1540, by the end of the 16th century, you had a community of 300,000 Catholics in Japan. At this point, when he arrived, the country was divided. So if the missionaries didn't get along with one shogun, they would move on and deal with another, and they could play them off against each other, because these shoguns were avid for trade with the Portuguese. It was kind of a lucrative business because everyone was wild about things that Japan had in Europe. So that sort of sets the stage. At a certain point, the competition for trade got pretty intense, because it wasn't just the Portuguese. Now the Dutch and the English were involved. And at this point, the whole Protestant-Catholic split entered the equation. There were Englishmen who would go and whisper to the shogun that the European European rulers didn't like the Jesuits any more than the Japanese did, and they worked with these people, and finally persecution broke out. And the persecution, 1597, Hideyoshi crucified 27 Christians, including children. Including a number of Europeans and Japanese Catholics.
But the main reason is that they said, well, these Jesuits are basically evil, where before the Jesuits were a blessing. I mean, they're bringing them the gospel, and the Japanese are receiving it.
The seed seemed to have fallen on fertile soil. That great an increase in that short amount of time. The Protestants hated the Jesuits because the Jesuits were the most effective force in the Counter-Reformation, rolling back Protestant advances in one country across the other. So they hated the Jesuits. And their hatred finally found its culmination in the 18th century, when the Jesuits got suppressed by the Freemasons. The Protestants had mutated into Freemasons by that point. But back in Japan, the persecution breaks out. The word is coming back to Portugal, and then suddenly word comes back that one of their own priests has apostatized.
Under torture.
He was tortured. So Father Ferreira, who used to be the man who taught this, the word comes out and reaches Portugal, and it's very upsetting.
It's upsetting because Christianity for them was enduring martyrdom.
Yeah. You had no choice in the matter. This was in distinction to the Jews. The rabbis always told the Jews they could lie under duress. And this led to the Converso crisis in Spain during the 15th century, where Jews were lying about whether they were Catholic or not, and their activities, and that led to the Inquisition. The Inquisition couldn't solve that problem, so basically Ferdinand and Isabella expelled the Jews. And they went to Holland and to Turkey, and that worked with the Protestants and the Turks.
I don't think Americans meditate on, can I endure martyrdom? What we have best is like the North Korean brainwashing camps. They try to torture you, and then some would break down and betray.
Some would, some wouldn't. But this is a man who is apostatized. So they don't believe it. So what you have now, this is where the novel begins. This is Shasuku Endo, a Japanese Catholic, who wrote the novel. It came out in 1966. So we're talking about basically the Japanese version of Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness is about the Congo, but there's Kurtz, there's the ivory trader who was gone native, and Marlowe was sent to find out what happened there. It's also Apocalypse Now. That's the other variation on this thing. So now we have the Japanese version where the Jesuits set off to find Ferreira, see if he really went native.
Because they can't believe it.
They can't believe the reports. So what you have here is really like a complex meditation on a lot of different things. So it's about missionary activity. There's no question about that. But it's also about 1966, which is when the novel came out. And it's about the crisis in missionary activity that afflicted the Catholic Church at this point. Shasuku Endo is a very sensitive guy. As I bring out, this crisis affected the entire world, the missionary activity through the entire world. As I point out in the review, Shasuku Endo is almost an exact contemporary of Julius Nyerere. And Julius Nyerere was brought into the Catholic faith by the Maryknoll missionaries. So the Jesuits interview Martin Scorsese, and in the middle they ask him what it was like growing up, and he says that in 1950 or 51 he wanted to become a Maryknoll missionary.
At age 8 or 9.
8 or 9. He was so. This was a moment, let's say, right after World War II, where the American missionary orders were thriving, and there was just this fertile activity, and Tanzania was an example of it, Tanganyika at that time, where basically the number of Catholics in Africa tripled and then quadrupled in the period from 1950 to 1970.
Well, in 1966, I had enrolled in the Holy Name Seminary out of Madison, okay, which I did not follow up on, but I took all the tests and everything. But I had this missionary, which would have been probably pre-Vatican II notions of missionary.
Yes.
It hadn't trickled down yet.
That's right. It hadn't trickled down unless you're in the Maryknolls, and they're agonizing now over these. So what's the crisis? What's the crisis at this point? The crisis is similar to the crisis that we talked about in Heart of Darkness. You're sailing up the Congo. There's this white guy. There's this jungle. Is there any logos here? Or the other side way of looking at it is Christ basically a European phenomenon? Is he the white man's God? What about the black man and the yellow man? Do they have the same God? That's what so Nyerere went through this issue, and he felt that he had to Africanize everything. So he's going to have African socialism, he's going to have African this, Ujamaa, and so on and so forth. And then he gets to the point, he arrives back at the Maryknolls in 1970, he lectures them saying, you've got to get with the program.
But you didn't bring up that he went to Edinburgh, Scotland,
Went to
got
Edinburgh.
educated, and so what was the effect of that education?
Turned him into a socialist. That was that simple. And Endo went through the same thing, except that he went to France and studied Catholic literature. They're both studying in Europe at the same time.
So the universities themselves kind of pointed him in the direction of...
Well, certainly socialism was the regnant ideology in England at this time. Capitalism had failed. Socialism was the ideology. So they're there and they're talking about socialism. And he comes back a committed socialist. And Endo comes back and his career starts taking off. But they have this kind of ambivalence about missionary activity now because of basically the racial consciousness of the liberation movements, anti-colonial movement. You have an anti-colonial movement across the world, certainly in Africa. And the question is, well, does this apply anymore? Well, it's bad enough that they get it, but the missionaries start getting infected with this idea. And that's part of the problem. And that's basically the setting for this novel.
But you didn't mention in the paper that the missionaries could have got it from their universities. In other words, their seminaries.
We call this the zeitgeist. There's an anti-globalist zeitgeist right now. It's just sweeping the world. Everybody hates globalism. Well, at that time, it was anti-colonialism. And everybody got swept up into it, and there are fundamental questions. And so Endo got swept up in his way, and this is his way of dealing with it. So he has the characters start talking. It basically becomes a discussion. So the Inoue is the inquisitor. He's the persecutor. And he conducts debates with Father Sebastian, who is the Jesuit who has just come over and got captured. And basically he says that, there's nothing wrong with your religion. It just doesn't apply here.
Were you thinking of the Grand Inquisitor with Dostoevsky?
Yeah, it's similar to that, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, this is a man who studied literature, who's familiar with all these literary texts. So he's saying basically, it's not that it's wrong, it just doesn't apply here. And we don't want it to apply, and we decided we're not going to allow it to take root. At this point, we get a debate, and the priest basically says, well, it applies everywhere. There's no geographical boundary to what I'm calling logos, or the message of God, and it goes back and forth, and he basically stops that line of argument. So that ends, and he doesn't, he's still, they're captive, he's still being persecuted. And at this point, he meets Ferreira, the priest who apostatized. And they have a long debate, and now we get into a subtler type of temptation, which is basically, you can prevent suffering if you apostatize.
Because the goal under this new gospel is to go against suffering.
That's right. And there's a sense now going around that the left is more compassionate than the church.
Because the church doesn't address suffering like they do.
No, they don't. And so, it's like, I don't know, you've seen this thing where the revolutionary comes to the kid and he says to the kid, pray to God for some candy. And then he says, you get any candy? And then he says, now ask me for some candy. Here's the candy.
Well, supposedly the Russian, the Soviet Union, under Stalin, they actually did that.
So this is their way of saying, we're going to really deal. This is the left. The left is in full cry at this point, and we're going to solve the world's problems that the church has failed to solve. And so we're now seeing that the priest is subjected to this, and so finally, after he's complaining about silence the whole time. All these people are suffering, he's praying, and where's God? God is silent. Well, you got the wrong theology there.
But that does connect back to Thomas Paine and the American Revolution, where it was a deist kind of God.
Well, they're saying that Jesus Christ is silent, and this Christianity is silent and has not solved the problem. This has been dealt with. I mean, it's not as if no one has ever thought about suffering before in the Catholic Church. St. Paul of the Cross is the founder of the Passionist nuns, and I was there I gave them a talk, and they told me about what he said. He said that Jesus Christ is on the cross, and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And what did God say at that point?
Well,
do you remember what God said?
It's not recorded.
There's nothing. It was silent. God was silent. So then St. Paul of the Cross says, well, does this mean God disapproved of Christ's sacrifice? Well, no, that's ridiculous. Of course he approved of it. So therefore, silence means approval. And this becomes the hermeneutic. Because he said, if you were doing something wrong, God would bring it to your attention.
Well, let me just link in. God wasn't silent, because in the Old Testament, it said the Messiah would rise after 3 days. So he wasn't silent.
But he was at that moment.
Well, you didn't hear anything.
And everyone is confronted with a situation like this. In your life, you can say, I can say with certitude that what seemed like a bad thing that was causing suffering at the time was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because I couldn't see it at the time. And I just had to persevere in that suffering until finally the whole plan became clear to me. We all have moments like that. We all have moments where I don't understand this at all, generally when you're going through it.
Right, and everybody reacts different to that. Some rage against God.
Yeah, so the question is, how do you decide here? How do you decide? Well, it's by faith, and faith has certain rules, and the rules have been established by Christ. So what you're saying here is that Father Sebastian here now is the Japanese gave up on trying to torture the priest. They felt that the priest really wanted to be tortured and die. and because they become martyrs, and it would be a success. So what they did was they tortured the Japanese Catholics in front of the priest, and then they would say, "You're responsible for this suffering. Of course, you can alleviate the suffering too. All you have to do is step on the image of Christ, apostatize." And they say, "You don't have to believe it when you're doing it. It's just a formality, but if you go through with that, you will stop suffering." This is where you're going beyond Christianity. And some people think that, interpret this as that Father Sebastian achieved a higher level of spirituality because he went beyond Christianity. Well, in my humble opinion, you don't go beyond Christianity. And in a sense, the people, one of the best essays by a guy named Doak, who read the Japanese, said at that final moment where he thinks it is Jesus, it could be the devil. That's in Endo's book. It's not in Scorsese's movie. So Endo's book is a lot more sophisticated than Scorsese's movie because Scorsese made Scorsese's movie. And Scorsese has his own baggage to bring to this. And what is the baggage he brings? Well, he denied Christ.
In The Last Temptation of Christ.
The Last Temptation of Christ, which I wrote about 18 years ago when the movie showed up at
Notre Dame had him, and I was part of a protest group back then.
Yeah, I remember. I was there. I wrote an article on it. And I went and saw the movie, and it is a crude piece of blasphemy. There's no question about it. Now, what's the difference between Marty Scorsese and the Japanese martyrs? Well, they were tortured and broke under torture. There was no pressure on him. This is him trying to ingratiate himself with the Jews who run Hollywood because his career had been stalled. He wrote about this when he was talking about Last Temptation. He was in trouble. He had a very small budget. It was his last chance. And he decided to make Christ his vehicle to being a successful director again. And it succeeded. He succeeded. The Jews loved it because it's blasphemy. And Jews love blasphemy.
Well, he was being tortured by his own sins, perhaps. I mean, he was living
living
a very wicked lifestyle.
He was leading a wicked libertine lifestyle. His third marriage had failed her. He had walked out on his wife. He and Jamie Robbie Robertson of the band were living in a house on Mulholland Drive with wild, drug-fueled sex orgies. That's what he was doing at the time. And then, in a sense, there's a logical progression in that way of life toward blasphemy.
Yeah, because you could argue that type of torture internally from your sin could even be worse.
Yeah, so you're tormented and you blame God for your torment.
Mm-hmm.
So the difference between Scorsese and the priests, let's say Father Ferreira in Endo's novel, is that there's no torture with Scorsese. He did it as a gratuitous act to restart his career. Now that makes it particularly heinous, it seems to me, on my part. And I think what we see here is him once again trying to exercise his guilt. This is an exercise in guilt, or trying to absolve himself. So he talks to the Jesuits like, well, I'm one of you guys, I'm a Catholic just like you. Whether he goes to Mass, has he made his Easter duty, that's not clear, but it's clear he's promoting this. He went to the Vatican or arranged the showing of this film at the Vatican. There's a picture of him with the Pope, and so on and so forth. So I think he thinks he can do it to God. That you can, convince God that you're really helping Jesus out. You're really helping him out by denying him. Well, that's not what Jesus said. He said very specific things. He said, anyone who denies me in front of men, I will deny him in front of the Father.
And the church has always believed that.
You have no choice. You can't go through the motions and then pretend that you're still a secret, in good standing, Catholic in good standing. And so the end of the movie is basically Father Rodriguez now going, he's the same as Father Ferreira. He's in the same position. They get him a wife so they can implicate him, may violate his vow of celibacy. And he's basically now persecuting the church. but you get some sense that maybe there's a higher spirituality here at work. Some of these people actually talk this way. And so the end of the movie, we find he dies, and there he is in his coffin, and then they show his hand, and he's got a crucifix in his hand.
Yeah, so what was that?
So what does that mean? Does that mean you were really serving Christ all along by persecuting fellow Christians and stepping on his image, which he had to do on a regular basis because the Japanese didn't allow you just to do it once?
Well, but he was saving himself because he still was holding on to the cross.
So what do you think? What do you think this is? What does this mean? What is the meaning of this? It's not in the book. This is purely Marty Scorsese.
Well, he thinks that he's holding on to Christ. I mean, I was just talking to a fellow at church. He was saying he has a friend from seminary who became homosexual, and he believes he still has a relationship with God. Well, Scorsese wants to believe that he still has a relationship.
We all want to do it. And in a sense, so the two figures we have here in the movie are Judas and St. Peter. What's the difference between Judas and St. Peter?
For sure, Judas despaired and never sought forgiveness.
Right. So both of them denied Christ.
Well, yeah, Peter denied him.
There's a scene in the movie where there's this guy who's supposed to be the translator or something like that, and he lures him into a trap and betrays Father Sebastian. That's how he gets caught. And the shogun or the samurai, whoever the guy is, throws the money at him, just like Judas. 30 pieces. I think he got 300 pieces of silver. So
hoping to get the guild off him.
Maybe inflation, adjusted for inflation, you were now 300 pieces of silver as opposed to 30. But the guy keeps coming back and he keeps going to confession. He keeps betraying him and he keeps saying he's sorry and comes back.
He's thinking that could work.
Over and over and over again. And there's a part of me that says, yeah, that's right. Because, you're weak. And then so you need confession again. So then he plays his card. Christianity is only for strong people. What about weak people? Isn't Christianity for weak people too? Well, what's the answer to that question? This is like...
well, it's fundamentally for weak people, but weak people find their forgiveness in the Lamb of God, in the expiation of Christ's sacrifice.
Let me disagree with you.
Okay.
It's not for weak people. It's for strong people. Why do I say that? Because Jesus Christ said you have to persevere to the end.
Okay.
He who perseveres to the end...
Whoever overcomes shall inherit, Revelation, it says if you overcome, and it lists the whole... Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay.
So they can't be weak then. If you don't persevere to the end, you can't be saved.
Right, but it's a play on weak, because Paul...
When I'm weak, I'm strong.
Yeah, so you have to listen carefully.
Yeah, so what are we talking about? This is the play. When they're talking about weak, they're saying, I can abandon the faith. I can give up. I can cave in.
Because God blesses the weak.
Because God is merciful, or something like that. So it's a caricature. It's like the secular caricature of Christianity that we live with on a daily basis.
Right. It's a temptation of the devil.
Let's face it. Isn't the church homophobic? Isn't it hard on homosexuals?
Yeah, we're weak on our love toward the homosexual. We're weak.
Isn't this the constant rebuke against the church? That it's always being hard on people? That you're not supportive enough. I mean, the litany of people I've heard complaining about. It began, like in the 70s, it was women complaining.
But this goes back to this.
Homosexuals complaining. Someone's always complaining that the church is too harsh and discriminates and blah blah blah.
But it's going back to this anti-patriarchal, anti-authoritarian. They don't want the authority of God through His church.
It goes back to the revolution. And that brings us back to the Maryknols. At this point, the Maryknols capitulated to this zeitgeist. And so in Guatemala, the same order that is, bringing Nyerere into the church, 2 nuns and 2 priests go off and join the guerrillas in the mountains of Guatemala, in the jungles of Guatemala.
To fight oppressive authoritarianism.
Yeah. Well, so they had to go beyond Christianity in order to be effective. Christianity wasn't enough.
Well,
That's what we're talking about here.
the American abolitionist movement, which obviously is huge in this country, also appealed to a higher
That's
law.
exactly what we're talking about here. So there are people who are holier, they're more Catholic than the Pope. They're more supportive, blah, blah, blah. And that was the temptation, and that's what the movie's about. And it's when it's not about Marty's guilty conscience, it's about these people who feel they're superior. I guess he feels superior to the church. He's got a higher form of spirituality because he betrayed Christ. That's a really esoteric, high form of spirituality. Anyway, that's what the movie's about. That's what it allows. It's going to be the review will be in the February issue of Culture Wars, and it also brings in all the stuff that I'm going to be talking about in the book on Julius Nyerere, because with the collapse of the missionaries in missionary activity in Tanganyika, development economics collapsed too, because basically the missionaries were the only people who were effective in development economics. The governments just couldn't do it.
No, we did a show, I think over at Mark Bramer's house. I think you gave a talk on it. Yeah. And when you were discussing this project, it was that people were talking about maybe he could be canonized.
Yes.
And you're going to discover and go over and do the research, and maybe that's where your research would lead you, that suggesting he should be canonized.
Well, yeah, I mean, I met with the Bishop of Musoma. He gave me the story. He's already been declared a servant of God, which is the first step along the way.
But your research didn't.
Well, that's another. We got to end now. But that's another topic.
Okay.
We can talk about that.
Okay.
But I'm just saying that they're related, because this is we're talking about this failure of nerve on the part of the Catholic Church, as it came about because of the Second Vatican Council. Even though the documents, are still supportive of missionary activity, there was a crisis that just crept into the Catholic Church, and this movie is an example of it.
But don't you think by living in the American culture, which is you breathe the ideology of the pursuit of happiness, and then you're called to be a missionary, which is a call to martyrdom of sorts, and which
I think the nuns, there's evidence, I quote them in there, where nuns thought the Peace Corps was superior to the Maryknols.
Right.
So I was in Nairobi, I was in Kenya, at a game preserve. There's this good-looking American young lady. I said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "Oh, I'm in the Peace Corps." "Ah, the Peace Corps." She had gone to Berkeley. "Well, what's the Peace Corps do? What are you doing for the Peace Corps?" "Well, I'm handing out condoms." So
Right.
there you have the secular religion. That's the religion that, be hard to convince me that that's superior to what the Maryknols did. But they actually felt that way. The Maryknoll nuns, one of them actually, it's quoted in there, she said, "I'm joining the Peace Corps because it looks as if it's more effective than what I'm doing here with the Maryknolls."
Well, you were saying in the article that the moral law itself, the teachings of Christ, were becoming oppressive in and of themselves.
Yes.
So in other words, they're already oppressed, and then you put another layer of oppression
That's
on
right.
them, requiring them to follow the teachings of Christ. I mean,
Burdens that too heavy to bear.
yeah. And the Peace Corps, obviously, they're sexually liberated. They're not going to do that, because I know experience with Peace Corps people. Sexual liberation is kind of what they like.
Yeah. So there you have it. So that's it. That's what we're up against. Anyway, that's what it is.
Okay. Well, that's good. You're on top of things. This pattern of the gospel being placed secondary is really the crucial thing. It's got to be made primary, and we have to keep it primary.
That's
So
right.
thanks, Mike, for being on the show, Israel, and hopefully you'll be around to present the gospel in another form again.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good enough.